Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. I'd like to start this by actually checking, can everyone hear me? Can you put a plus sign in the comments just to check that everything is working okay? That's great to see, lots of plus signs. Good. If you have any problems with the sound as we go, if you try logging out and logging back in again, that should help re-establish the connection. The same idea if you have any problems with connectivity. But we will wait for everyone to log in and hopefully we'll start very soon. Some people are putting more than one plus sign. We're getting lots of 5 pluses and things, which is nice to see. Obviously, you're very enthusiastic. All right, I think now would be a good time to start. So as I said before, welcome everyone. My name is Rory Fergus Duncan Goodwillie. I work for BKC International House as an Assistant Director of Studies and a teacher trainer. Today, we're going to be looking at specifically preparing students for speaking online, in particular the A2 or CET exams and B1 PET. Throughout the presentation, feel free to ask questions. However, when you do ask questions, please do not post them in the chat. There's actually a special place to post questions if you look at the top of the sort of screen presentation. You'll see a place to write questions and that will highlight them. Obviously, we'll try and answer as many questions as we can. And of course, there will be time at the end. So please don't worry if your question is not answered immediately. There is time at the end to answer any questions that you have. In the meantime, though, we should get started. And like every good lesson and every good presentation, we should start by talking about the aims that we have for our presentation today. So, as you may have guessed from the title, we're looking at the speaking tasks from A2 and B1 preliminary. However, we're only going to look at these tasks as a brief overview before we provide practical ideas for helping our students develop their speaking skills as they progress in their preparation for this exam. The particular focus here is on things that can be done online, because of course, a lot of us now have switched over to an online format due to the current situation. And in addition to the aims that we have here, there are also going to be very simple, practical tips that any teacher can use in almost any format when teaching online. I think a lot of us are having a bit of difficulty making a transition, so keeping things as simple as possible is one of our goals. This in mind, if we consider the takeaway message from the presentation, which is, like I've said, keeping things very simple. So in light of that, I'd like to emphasize that a lot of the things that we're going to do today involve using conference applications and software. I'm going to be referring to the Zoom application quite a lot. Can you write in the chat, are you using Zoom or are you using any other kind of conferencing software for your online classes? I'm seeing Zoom rather a lot. Great, okay. Some people are also using Skype too. That's not a problem at all. If you're using Skype or if you're using any other kind of video conferencing software, then this is absolutely okay. And indeed, even if you're not using any video conferencing software, then some of these ideas can still be used by you as well. So please don't worry if you're not familiar with Zoom and if you're using other formats, that's okay. So Zoom will be our point of reference. However, like I say, you can use these for other conferencing applications too. In addition to that, in light of keeping things simple, I'll be referring to documents which are shareable and shared. So I'm using material in the presentation today from the handbooks for A2 and B1, which were created by Cambridge. Some of you will be using course books. Don't worry if you're using course books and you don't see any material from course books today. The advice I'm going to give you can be used for these as well, so that's not such a problem. In the same way, I'm going to be referring to Google Docs a lot for this. This is an online document format, similar to Microsoft Word or something that you would be familiar with using offline. I use Google Docs with my students, but again, there are other formats. All of the things that we're going to be looking at today for online are easily transferable to all of these, so please don't worry if you're not familiar with them. In the same way, we're taking materials from the handbooks. I should say, when we're taking materials from the handbooks, I'm using them in a PDF format. The PDF format allows me to use a function called snapshot, which means that you can literally copy and paste different parts of documents from the documents themselves and onto the online format. If you can do something similar with yours, that's great. A lot of people use PDF. However, there are alternatives. There's also something called Foxit Reader, which can be downloaded for free, and you can use this as well. Of course, regardless of whatever you're using, if you're taking copied material from copyrighted material like course books, always remember to add a copyright line just to keep everything nice and legal. So those are the things which we're referring to today when we look at our materials. The very last thing to point out about being online is, of course, that in addition to having our materials prepared, we should also have our mindsets prepared. I'm sure lots of us are familiar with having problems with connectivity and students not being familiar with how to do things online. So, of course, when we do this, we are patient and we are as prepared in advance as much as possible. And I'll be showing you in terms of online preparation what to do. So, if we move on from here and have a look at A2 speaking, here's a very brief overview of the tasks that are involved in the A2 speaking test. So, as you can see, there are two main parts. The first part involves a conversation between the interlocutor and the candidate. And then we move on from asking sort of simple social questions to topic-based things. When we talk about topic-based, it's talking about very simple things for A2 format, like friends and family and work, these kind of familiar topics, just to get students started talking. And in the same way, in the second format, it moves on to slightly different formats and slightly different topics, less familiar to candidates, where they'll be asked to compare and describe things. They're not asked to describe photographs yet. It's more like pictures that have been drawn or created using drawing software. And of course, it's a shift away from talking to the interlocutor and more to talking to their partner. They're expected to have a discussion about what they see in these pictures as well. So with this in mind, this is what is expected of the candidates. And as you can see, they're expected to talk for a total of up to 10 minutes. If you look 3 to 4 minutes for part 1 and 5 to 6 minutes for part 2. So we have to talk about tips for teaching this particular subject online. So I've broken it down here to part 1. So they have to talk about daily life, interests, likes and dislikes. And then part 2, comparing, describing, expressing opinions, and exchanging ideas. But how to get students to do this? Now, of course, we could present this to the students. We could just show them the material and say, okay, now you have to speak. But we need to actually try and modify our materials to make them a little bit more accessible to students and encourage them to talk, give them a purpose for talking. So with this in mind, we could just start with something very simple. I'm going to type a message in the chat and one word will be missing. Your job is to type back and say what you think the missing word is. Now, on webinar.ru, it's not possible for students to speak, but if you're using online video conferencing software, then of course, instead of actually just typing what they think the missing word is, then the students actually have to say what they think the missing word is. So it's a good chance for them to practice vocabulary. So I'll type in that gap fill into the chat now and see what results we get. So the comment in the chat is, most of my friends are blank. So what would you put in that space to describe your friends? And feel free to chat in the comments as well. Some people are saying friendly, nice, supportive, mad. Oh, wow, okay. Great. It's good to see lots of positive vocabulary here as well. Excellent. We can change it slightly. So if we could talk about most of my friends. If there are any students in the chat, let's change it a little bit now to teachers. So instead of friends, let's say most of my teachers, again, most of my teachers are blank. And then you've got to respond to this. Some people have said the best. Great. Oh, beautiful. Okay, wonderful. Great. We're seeing lots of people saying the best, which is fantastic. So, like I say, a really simple task, just to get students speaking and guessing what the appropriate word is. And it's a good warm-up exercise. You could select something which uses the vocabulary that you've studied in previous lessons, whether you were talking about teachers or parents, whatever you like. And it can be vocabulary, like adjectives here for describing people, or it can be things like places. So I would like to go to blank when the quarantine is over, and then places where people would like to go. However, we need to focus on interaction for the exam format as well. So when you move on from a warm-up exercise like this, we actually have to get students talking to each other. One way of doing this is actually something very similar to what we do in the classroom. Here I've called it role plays and grids. Now, in the exam itself, there will be several people. There will be the candidates and another candidate. So there'll be two candidates and an interlocutor, and the examiner as well, who is assessing them back. Now, we can get people to assume the roles of up to 3 or 4 of these different people. How to do this, though? If you look at the next page, we can see some examples. Now, here are 2 screenshots taken from something that I've done previously with my students. On the left, you can see screen captures taken from the Cambridge handbooks, like I was talking about before. I just copied and pasted them, and you could do this with your students in the class. So they read like it's a script. One student is the examiner or the interlocutor reading the script, and the other 2 students are the candidates answering the questions. You could do this in a classroom, and that wouldn't be a problem. However, you do have to do this online with multiple students at the same times. So I modified this slightly to make it more accessible for an online format using Google Docs. So there are, I used Zoom breakout rooms where there were 3 people, one playing the role of the interlocutor with the questions, and 2 people in the role of candidates. The person who is the interlocutor, the student who is the interlocutor, has this form here on the right-hand side of the screen. I'm just turning on the pointer to indicate what I'm talking about now. The interlocutor has the script, and they could just read the script. However, if we're dealing with young people, they tend to get a bit bored of just mindlessly reading scripts. So instead, I also gave the interlocutor a job. And the job of the interlocutor is to complete the script, asking the questions to the other candidates and writing in the information that they give. This will be important. If you're a teacher of large classes using software like Zoom, then it can be difficult to monitor multiple conversations at the same time. However, with this, what you can do is you could create different Google Docs for each group. And that way, when you're in one breakout room monitoring and supervising other candidates and other groups, you can also see the documents for other groups as well, watching to see if they're being completed normally. And you can use this to see which groups need help and which candidates or which interlocutors in their roles are struggling. So it helps you know where you're needed as a teacher, rather than just relying on students to come and ask you for support. Because first of all, our students are A2 and B1 level if we're preparing them for KET and PET. They might not know how to do this. And of course, if they're young people, they might not feel very comfortable asking the teacher for help. So this is a very good way of looking for this. To give you a little bit more detail about this, you can see at the bottom, for candidate B, this box is blacked out. The reason for this is because candidate B is not asked for information about their friends. Actually, they'll be asked a different set of questions. And what you can do at this point is you can use a different Google Doc to change the roles. So here, one student is playing the role of the interlocutor for two students, but when the questions change, another student can take this role, and the other two students can now be the candidates instead. Some people are asking how to make breakout rooms in Zoom. So if you're not sure how to use breakout rooms in Zoom, I'm afraid I can't actually show you right now in the current format, but if you're not sure, then on YouTube, for example, there are lots of videos to show how to do this. The other thing I should mention about this as well is in light of just going back to our idea of being prepared in advance, you will need to prepare multiple documents depending on the size of your class. So let's say you have 9 students in your class. That will be 3 groups of 3 students. So it's important to have 3 different Google documents prepared in advance. Otherwise, you might find students are using the same document, which could get a little bit confusing for them. However, this is easy to do because, like in any document, online or offline, you can just copy and paste the questions. And the students in their breakout rooms, or whichever format you're using, they won't have this problem. They'll avoid using the same document. And then the other thing that it's important to point out, if we're using Google Docs in particular, I'm not sure how it works on other online formats, but please make sure that when you send these documents to the students that you enable them to edit. Otherwise, they will not be able to type in their answers. They'll only be able to view the documents. In the same way, make sure that it's clear which group you're sending them to. So whenever I do this, I send a message in the chat like group number 1, and then I copy the URL or the address of this particular document. Group number 2 and the address for that document. That's important because, again, we want to avoid students using these documents overlapping with each other. So this is just a small part of preparation beforehand, but it does make a big deal of difference when you're actually in the class, so you can use as much of your time as possible. If we go back, though, from just using grids and role plays, we also have part 2 to consider. And for part 2, we've got to use checklists and disappearing dialogues. Now, what do I mean when I talk about these kinds of things? So if we have a look at the examples here, let's look at the checklists first. Now, if you look in the handbooks for KET or PET exams, you'll see that they have not only word lists, but lists of functions that students are expected to complete. So again, instead of actually just giving the students the task and saying, now you have to speak, it's a good idea to let them structure this a little bit and prepare beforehand in advance. So here, if you look in the top left, I have cut out the task, which is, do you like these different places to eat? And then you can see there are different pictures of places where people can eat. I gave this document to a pair of students, and I asked them to create a dialogue for this. Now, why did I ask them to create a dialogue? Well, we'll get to that. However, once the dialogue is completed, there's a third student who is introduced to the breakout room, in this case, when we're using Zoom. Now, the student has a list of different functions. These are taken from the word lists and from the list of functions in the A2 handbook. And so all the student has to do is listen to the other candidates while they're talking, and so while they're listening, they can tick off the different things which they are hearing the candidates come out with. Now, for the students that I have at this level, they're slightly more advanced. They know what to listen for. So here, if the students are talking about food or ordering meals, then they can listen for the specific language. However, if you don't have students who are familiar with this kind of language, or if they're not sure exactly what it is they're listening for, then what you can do instead is you could write a list of functional language that they should be hearing, and then they can listen and they can tick off at the same time. So if we say talking about food and ordering meals, for example, maybe the students need to listen for things like burger, pizza, this kind of thing. This is quite useful for developing students' listening skills as well as their speaking skills and their awareness of what's expected of them when they actually do the exam as well. However, we have to get the students to speak first. And this is where the dialogue comes in. Now, the students create the dialogue. Again, in the Google Doc, we've made it accessible for them to edit. And if you look in this part of the screen, I've left it open for them here. So I had two students in this case, John and Felipe. They weren't my students, actually. They were my colleagues. However, they can write their dialogue here in preparation for talking about this. So it's a lot like a chat room, we had a very long time ago. Now people are using Zoom, but before people used chat rooms where they would just type what they were going to say. The advantages of using this format instead of using a chat room is your job as a teacher becomes monitoring what the different students are writing in preparation for their dialogue. So you can do things like highlight mistakes if they're not highlighted already, because again, the other advantage of using online document software is they have a spell checker and they have a grammar checker as well. So, for example, if someone says, do you do swimming instead of do you go swimming, then it will underline there. And the students already have an opportunity to correct themselves without the teacher jumping in. So your job monitoring is made much easier in this case. In the same way, what you can do after the students complete their dialogue and then you get them to practice together in the breakout room, then you, as a teacher, can switch the mode from edit to view. So the students can no longer edit the dialogue at all. They can only see the dialogue. And then you can control how much of the dialogue gets deleted, and the students have to remember exactly what it is they were talking about in this particular circumstance. And this means that they can memorize some key phrases and to try and do the same task multiple times in order to help them develop their oral fluency, for example. Your job is just to listen to what they say and take notes about any mistakes that they make. Alternatively, if you have students who are a bit more engaged, then you can ask them to sit and you can have three people. Two students will be speaking and another student, like this one here in the bottom left, can be taking notes about what students say. You just need to change the format to a grid so they can record their mistakes. We'll look at that in a bit more depth later. Another advantage to this as well is that you can change the activity very quickly. So the students, once you highlight key phrases that they can use for every single task, then all you need to do is change the task and copy and paste in the highlighted phrases that you think will be useful for them later on in different tasks, and then they can recreate a new dialogue around that. So it's like revising phrases and integrating what they've already done in their existing vocabulary. Oh, I have another question. Someone is asking, are there any checklists on speaking available in PDF format? Yes, there are. If you go to the Cambridge Resources for Teachers website, you can download the handbooks. And at the back of the handbooks, there's a list of all of these things here. So it's very easy to find and very easy to use with your classes, just by copying and pasting. One other thing to mention is that the lists, like I say, they can be broad like this, or they can be specific. Now, I mentioned hearing keywords like specific grammar and vocabulary, but it could be can or can't, for example, this kind of thing. Someone has asked to repeat the resource. Yes, the resource is the handbook for teachers, and indeed our moderators just posted where it is in the chat, so you can go there and you can download it for free. It's not a problem. Now, this is for A2. However, we also have to talk about B1 as well. So with this in mind, we'll move on to talk about B1 speaking. Slightly more complicated, but you might notice that there are some similarities to the A1 in terms of we start out with a conversation with the interlocutor and the candidates. But then it becomes a little bit different. We have to have an individual long turn where we talk about photos. And now, this is one of the great things for teaching online. You don't have to prepare your photos in advance. You can find them immediately with a Google search. So in this case, that's actually making this a lot easier to teach and prepare for online. And then we move from part 2 to part 3, where the students talk together. So they're having a conversation and the interlocutor is just describing the situation to them. And then after that, there's a longer discussion involving all three people, so the two candidates and the interlocutor as well, who's asking questions. Now, that's the overarching format. However, we should also talk about what we can do with this. So if we have a look here, there are 4 different parts. Now, this is just, I'll just walk you through this, but if you want to have a look at the presentation in more depth later. Part 1, we can use a very similar thing to what we'd used for part 1 for the A2 level, but we'll make a few changes and we'll look at that in a bit more depth in a second. Same thing for part 2. We'll look at checklists and word lists. However, again, that gets slightly more complex at this level. Someone is asking if the session will be recorded. Yes, it should be recorded and should be posted later on. And then we have part 3, candidate discussion. Now we'll look at dialogue creation here, but there's a little bit more to do with this. And then the same thing for part 4, we need to look at role plays and grids again, but there's something else that we can do with the role plays here. So if we look at part 1 again, it's almost exactly the same thing. However, so everything is as you saw it in the previous part for when we were talking about part 1 for Ket. Here is the script that the interlocutor has to refer to, and here we've got different grids for the person who's the interlocutor. Now, what I did here was, because the candidates are at a slightly higher level and probably don't need to refer to a script so much, if you look in the column here where the questions are supposed to be, they don't have the full questions. The reason for this is because it gives the interlocutor a chance to actually practice their English a bit more with fewer prompts. So it's not like they're reading from a script and they don't get so bored. In the same way, instead of recording individual words, I asked the 2 students here to just record, to record phrases and sentences that they came out with. This is quite important for your monitoring as a teacher, because of course you want them to see exactly how good the students are able to recognize individual words and record them down. So you're almost testing their listening skills at the same time as they are practicing and developing their speaking skills. I put the script underneath here for a weaker student who might not be so comfortable speaking or trying to work out what it is they have to say. However, as a teacher, you can decide if students need the support or if you want to take it away. And even what you can do is, as the students practice and develop over time, you can actually start to delete certain parts of the script, so the students don't always have the same support and they become more independent. So that's just a little extra, a little less scaffolding for B1 level students, because they should be developing a little bit more. If we switch over now to talk about part 2. Now, earlier I described using word lists and using things which were a little bit more specific. So, as you can see, I have 2 students here. One is preparing what they're going to say about this particular picture, and the other one has a list like this. Now, these 2 tasks are not quite the same in terms of being demanding. So what you could do is either ask one student to prepare what they're going to say about a picture, and then you can monitor them and check that they're using the correct language, the correct grammar and vocabulary, and you can highlight words which maybe need to be changed. And the other student who has the checklist can brainstorm things that they expect to hear. And this works quite well for stronger students who perhaps want to prepare a little bit more for what they're going to do, which is listen to another student describe the picture and then tick. As you can see here, they've got some ticks for different things the student is saying. However, this might not be a very engaging task for all the students. So instead, what you might want to do is show both candidates, or both students in this case, their pictures at the same time, and have them prepare their monologues at the same time. And then when one student is speaking, the other one has their checklist. This works well because it stops students from being bored if they run out of things to brainstorm that they're going to hear. It will depend entirely on what your students are going to hear, or indeed what their strengths and weaknesses are. In the same way, you want to check and make sure that the student who is listening is actually listening. Now, if people are very trustworthy and very strong, which is absolutely fine, then you can see that they're listening from the fact that they are ticking on the word list here. That's okay. But maybe you want to see if they're listening for specific things and they're not just ticking things randomly because they're not really listening. So in this case, what you can ask students to do is you could give them aspects of language to listen for, and then you need them to listen for examples of this in what they hear other students say. Another possibility for this kind of task is that students can do peer correction as well. So, for example, once the students have created their dialogues, you can ask them to exchange the monologues. You can ask them to exchange their monologues, and they can do two things. They could either mark things that can be improved, or if students are a little bit more sensitive and don't like to be corrected by others, then they can underline things that they think are good as well. The reason for this is not just so that the students can feel good about themselves, of course. It's so that they can actually even take things from texts which might be useful for them when they're looking at their texts. That's for part 2. However, we also have part 3 to deal with. In this case, part 3 isn't a photograph. It's a series of 3 different pictures. As you can see, the task is activities to help the man relax. This is what the students will see. However, what I asked students to do instead was I gave them the pictures itself, and I also gave them the description of the situation. Usually this is what would be read out by the interlocutor. However, the students need to have a broader understanding of what it is, what the task actually is, so that they can successfully complete what it is they're going to do, which is create a dialogue. This is similar to what is required of them by. This is similar to what we talked about for part 2 of A2 speaking. However, students actually have to aim towards using specific language themselves. Someone has just asked a similar question there in the comments. So here, for part 3 of the exam, shall the students discuss all the options and make a decision together? I don't think they have to discuss all of the options. However, they do have to be approaching a decision for this, if not making an actual decision itself. This is important because you as the teacher are looking at what the dialogue the candidates are creating, and you can check to see if they're doing what's actually required of them in this task. Now, if we look back at what is actually required of the students in this task, we can see here making and responding to suggestions, discussing alternatives, making recommendations, and negotiating agreement. So you can see that they must do these things in the actual tasks themselves. So if we have a look at what's actually being said, you can see underneath the dialogue that's emerging. So in this case, we have 2 students, Anna and John, and they're talking about the different options here. However, you can see, because the dialogue is not finished yet, that they're not actually looking at anything nearly being close to coming to some kind of conclusion or some kind of agreement. So what you could do as the teacher is, well, first of all, you can wait and see what happens, or you could copy and paste a phrase that would be useful for this into the task itself and allow the students to try and integrate this into what they're writing and then change their dialogue accordingly. Now, there's lots of opportunities here for students to edit their work and then for the teacher to interact with them as well. Once they're done with part 4, once they're done with part 3, they'll have part 4 to look at. Now, in part 4, they're supposed to have a discussion. And in this case, when you have a discussion between yourselves and the interlocutor, it's a little bit more complicated to create a dialogue because, well, first of all, it's not a dialogue. And the more people that you add to the situation of creating a script, the more complicated it will become and the messier it can be. So with this in mind, what we can do is we can give this set of questions to one student or who is in the role of the interlocutor. So they have their questions. Meanwhile, in different Google documents for the other students in the class, you have different role cards. The role cards are based on what has been, well, what the questions actually are in the script that the interlocutor has to read. Now, you could just copy and paste this just direct to the Google Doc that the interlocutor has. However, what can be done is you can shorten the questions. Maybe you could miss out some verbs and ask the interlocutor to either complete these questions just by typing in what they think the answer is or what the question is, or you could ask the interlocutor to speak and say what they think the questions are. So you can test the grammar and vocabulary and pronunciation of students, as well as getting them to practice their speaking skills. This will be quite useful for just checking to see how students are doing. You can, when it comes to creating the role cards, here I've made, well, if we look at John's, for example, I've given him different things like he likes to do crazy things, he hates exercising, but he loves to learn about new things, especially things about space. So here, this should inform his answers to what the interlocutor says. Anna's card here has the exact opposite of what John will say. So the interlocutor has to listen carefully and actually listen to what it is the students are saying. Now, you might get a student who is quite happy to just sit and answer the questions and ask them, and everything is fine. However, sometimes students get bored and they don't really like to wait for other people to speak, even if they want to think about what it is they're going to say. So, with this in mind, you could do what we've done for previous tasks and provide grids similar to this one here for speaking part 1. And that way students actually have a reason to listen to their partner and to respond, and in the same way the interlocutor has something to do other than just ask questions. And in the same way, if you have a grid like this, your job as a teacher becomes much easier, because all you need to do, even if you are looking at one group and you're in a breakout room with one group, but in another group, you might want to look at what it is they're saying. So that brings us to the end of different practical things that can be done in breakout rooms. However, there are problems with this. So with this in mind, well, here are 2 of my problems that I think might happen. Even if you have these different worksheets and tabs open on your Internet Explorer, for example, or on Google Chrome, you might still find it's quite difficult to monitor students in breakout rooms in Zoom, for example. So in this case, we can, well, in the case of Zoom, it's possible to add your smartphone to Zoom, and then they can, while your smartphone is in one breakout room, you are in another. This is a little bit difficult to listen to at first, because you have to divide your attention between your phone and what's being said in the breakout room. But it does help you just check and see what it is students are actually doing, and you can monitor their behavior as well if you need to. The other thing is motivation. If we're teaching adult students, then this will be remarkably easy to do, because adults are quite happy to work on everything. But if we have younger students, this might be a problem. So the first thing to do is add some personalization to this. Now, this is very easy with individual questions where we're asking, what do you like to do? What are your friends like? What are your parents like? But we also have, well, we have set tasks like, if we go back to here, part 4, we have these discussion questions. So another thing you could ask students to do is, instead of actually writing just part of the discussion questions. They can write their own discussion questions. And again, because they're choosing what it is they want to say, then it becomes much easier for them and to become involved in the process and not to just become bored with saying different things like grammar exercises, for example. Another thing is to inject some creativity into this. So if we look at what we had before, I tried to be a bit creative when I said people like John, for example, in his role cards, likes to do crazy things, and he likes to find out interesting things about space. You could do this for your students, or you could ask them to make their own role cards, and in that case, they don't have to work. They don't become so bored because the teacher is doing everything for them. So, and the last thing is, when it comes to motivation, people need to have breaks from the screen. If you're working, sorry, excuse me. If you're working constantly looking at the screen, it can become very boring and disengaging for students. So make sure that you have activities to give them a break from the screen as the lesson progresses. So things like, can you find something in your room which is green? And then the students have to find something which is green, just to give them some breaks from the constant exercises. And then once the teacher gives some examples, then the students can also ask each other to find something, just so they have a little bit more control and they don't get so bored. However, those are just two of the possible problems that could be with this. I'd like to ask now, does anyone have any problems when they are teaching their classes on, well, in an online format? It could be in Zoom or using Google Hangouts, for example. So you're very welcome to ask any questions about the problems you have now. Someone has asked about helping students use slightly more advanced vocabulary because they tend to use lower level vocabulary. So in this case, it will depend on the part of the exam they're preparing for. However, what you could do is you could look at the list of words that students are required to use, and then you could copy and paste some of these into the dialogues that they're creating. So in this case, you're helping students by giving them small hints about which words to integrate. Some people have talked about students being unaware of how to use their devices. Yes, that's very true. We're experiencing a lot of these problems now as we switch over to the online format. Uh, there are different ways to approach this. It will depend on the kind of relationship you have with your students. So in this case, you could email them before the lesson in whichever their native language is, and just explain a list of instructions, how to use the different pieces of technology that you're dealing with. The other thing is some teachers are sensitive about this, but if you're not so sensitive about it, you could explain in Russian, if you're talking to Russian-speaking students, exactly how to use the device. It's only for explaining how to use something which will help them use English in the lesson. Alternatively, you could, if you don't speak the same language as your students, you could try translating some instructions and using chat functions. Some people have asked about how to work with the B1 word list during preparation. It's very long. This is a really good question. And what I would say is, obviously, yes, the word list is very long. So, two things to do. The first thing would be to have some kind of diagnostic test or needs analysis at the beginning of the course, just to see exactly what it is that students struggle with. And then you can choose which vocabulary they need for this. If you're more comfortable with giving students some more freedom, you can actually share the word list with them, and you could see, you could just ask them, do you understand what all of these words mean, or which words do you not understand? And then you can use this as the foundation for teaching vocabulary in a lesson. The other thing, of course, is that if you have a very long course, then you can break the word list up into short parts for the students too. If they're preparing to take this exam in 2 to 3 months, then it will be important to have a little bit more focus to this. Someone has also asked about how to encourage students to use the topic vocabulary and how to integrate it into speaking beforehand. That's a very good question. And I suppose it would go back to what I said about encouraging students to use the vocabulary by copying and pasting it into their dialogues when they're preparing. And then when you're monitoring what it is they say, then asking them, just reminding them, oh, is there a better word, for example? And then you can prompt them accordingly and drill this vocabulary with them as well. Someone has asked about advice on preparing students in one-to-one classes, so with one teacher and one student. I think almost everything that we've looked at here in terms of activities, it's possible to use this with one-to-one students as well. So instead of a teacher being the monitor, the teacher is the interlocutor instead. So the teacher is asking questions and the student is answering them. Alternatively, to take a nice break from that, you could change these roles, and instead the student is the interlocutor and the teacher is answering them. The students might find that quite a fun thing to do every now and then. Someone is asking if it's possible to use the interactive whiteboard differently. I think, oh sorry, the interactive board differently. It is possible. I suppose you could ask students to use it for word lists, for example, and use that to tick off word lists instead. Instead of doing that, I use Google Draw, but it's possible to use it for this as well. All right. We'll move from problems to questions more generally now. So at this stage, does anyone have any questions about anything for preparing students for the A2 or for the B1 exams? All right. So it seems like there are no further questions, which is not a problem at all. However, if you have any more, then you're very welcome to join the other 2 seminars that we have this week. There will be one on Wednesday from 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock, and another one on Friday from 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock at the same time as today. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and I hope you have a good day and enjoy your classes. Bye-bye.